She never imagined that a simple smile could lead to her darkest nightmare. Emma Walters, a 34-year-old married woman, lived a peaceful life with her husband Jack in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Their home, a cozy, well-kept house on a tree-lined street, was the epitome of comfort and safety. Emma was well known among her neighbors for her warmth and kindness, always ready with a smile or a helping hand. She loved her life, her husband, and the community they had built together over the past decade. Emma's days were filled with routine, morning jogs, grocery shopping, and spending time with her close-knit group of friends. She enjoyed simple pleasures, like tending to her garden and cooking elaborate meals for Jack, who worked long hours at a law firm in the city. Their marriage was strong, built on trust and mutual respect. They were a team, supporting each other through thick and thin. But everything began to change when a new neighbor moved in next door. Tom Hudson, a quiet man in his mid-40s, had recently divorced and relocated to the suburban area, seeking solitude and a fresh start. At first, Emma and Jack welcomed him warmly. Emma, in particular, went out of her way to be friendly, often stopping to chat with Tom whenever she saw him outside. She saw it as an act of kindness, just being a good neighbor. For Tom, however, Emma's friendliness felt like a lifeline. Her smile, her laughter, and her wave from the garden took on a meaning far beyond what Emma intended. To Tom, they were not just signs of neighborly kindness. They were signals of something deeper, something personal. His casual interest quickly grew into a dangerous fixation. Emma first noticed a twinge of unease on a warm summer evening. After returning from her evening walk, she noticed Tom standing on his porch, staring at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time, she truly noticed how his eyes followed her every move, how his expression was one of longing mixed with something darker, something unsettling. She brushed off the discomfort, telling herself she was being silly. But that night, as she sat down for dinner with Jack, the feeling lingered. She found herself glancing out the window, half expecting to see Tom standing there watching her. But the street was quiet, and she chided herself for letting her imagination get the best of her. However, Tom's behavior only became more intrusive. The next morning, he was waiting outside as Emma left for her jog. He waved with a familiarity that made her uncomfortable. When he offered to accompany her on her run, she politely declined. But Tom persisted, jogging alongside her for a few blocks before she managed to lose him in the park. That evening, she mentioned Tom's behavior to Jack, laughing it off as a quirky neighborly trait. But Jack noticed the tension in her voice and the way her hands fidgeted with her napkin. He suggested she distance herself from Tom if he was making her uncomfortable. Emma agreed, but knew it wasn't that simple. Her unease grew into something more, a quiet, gnawing fear that she couldn't quite explain. She began to avoid unnecessary interactions with Tom, no longer stopping to chat or acknowledging his presence beyond a polite nod. But Tom was persistent. He found reasons to come over, borrowing tools, needing help with his lawn, or bringing over packages supposedly delivered to the wrong address. Each encounter left Emma feeling more vulnerable, more trapped in her own home. Then came the notes. It started with a simple message left on her doorstep: "You have a beautiful smile." Assuming it was from Jack, she thought nothing of it, but when he denied leaving the note, a cold realization settled in. The next day, another note appeared, this one more unsettling. "I think about you all the time." The notes kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "I dream about you every night. I can't stop thinking about you." Emma's fear began to escalate. She dreaded finding the notes, yet each morning, like clockwork, another would be waiting for her. They were always written in the same neat handwriting, unsigned, but she didn't need a signature to know who they were from. Emma's initial discomfort turned into full-blown anxiety. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if Tom was watching her. She no longer felt safe, even in the presence of Jack. The notes were a silent invasion of her privacy, a constant reminder of someone's dangerous obsession. Jack, now fully aware of the situation, was livid. He wanted to confront Tom, but Emma stopped him, fearing that a confrontation might escalate the situation. They agreed to install security cameras around the house, hoping that the presence of surveillance would deter Tom's advances. But the cameras did nothing to stop the notes. Instead, they seemed to embolden Tom. The notes became more detailed, more personal. "I know you're unhappy. I can make you happy. We belong together, Emma. Why can't you see that?" The messages were no longer just expressions of admiration. They were declarations of a delusional love that didn't exist. Emma's days were consumed with fear. She started avoiding going outside altogether, too scared to even step into her garden. She would wait for Jack to come home before checking the mailbox or taking out the trash. The once peaceful and welcoming neighborhood now felt like a prison, with Tom's house looming like a threat just next door. The breaking point came one evening when Jack was working late. Emma was alone in the house, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the empty street. She tried to distract herself by watching TV, but her mind kept drifting to the front door, to the possibility that Tom might be outside, watching her, waiting for an opportunity. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, startling her. Emma's heart raced as she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She peered through the peephole and saw Tom standing there, his face illuminated by the porch light. He was holding something, a small bouquet of flowers. Her first instinct was to ignore him, to pretend she wasn't home. But Tom didn't leave. He rang the bell again, and then again, with increasing urgency. Finally, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She cracked the door open just a sliver, her voice shaky as she spoke. "Tom, what are you doing here?" Tom smiled, that same unnerving smile that had once seemed harmless. He held out the flowers as if they were lovers and not neighbors. "I brought these for you, Emma. I know you've been avoiding me, but I just want to talk. I just want to make things right." Emma felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "There's nothing to talk about, Tom. You need to stop this. This has gone too far." Tom's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you doing this to me, Emma? Why are you pretending like you don't feel the same way? I know you're unhappy. I can make you happy." Emma's grip tightened on the door, ready to slam it shut. "You need to leave, Tom. Now." But Tom didn't move. His expression darkened, and for the first time, Emma saw the true extent of his obsession. There was no reasoning with him, no convincing him that his feelings were misplaced. To him, this was real. This was love. "I'm not leaving until you admit it," Tom said, his voice low and menacing. "Admit that you love me." Fear paralyzed Emma. She realized that this wasn't just a harmless crush. Tom was dangerous. Her heart pounded in her chest as she mustered the strength to slam the door shut. She locked it and backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Outside, she could hear Tom's voice, muffled but insistent. He was pleading, begging her to let him in. Emma grabbed her phone and called Jack, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial the number. When he answered, she couldn't hold back the tears. "Jack, please come home. He's here. Tom's here." Jack raced home as fast as he could, his mind consumed with worry. Emma's voice on the phone had been frantic, unlike anything he had ever heard from her before. The thought of Tom standing outside their house, harassing his wife, filled him with rage. He knew he needed to get there quickly, but he was also afraid of what he might find when he arrived. Meanwhile, Emma was trapped inside her own home, her mind racing with fear. She could still hear Tom outside, pacing back and forth on the porch, muttering to himself. Occasionally, he would knock on the door, his voice taking on a pleading tone as he asked her to come outside, to talk to him, to give him a chance. But Emma knew better. She knew that opening that door would be a mistake, one she might not live to regret. She tried to focus on the sound of Jack's voice in her head, telling her to stay calm, to stay strong. But the fear was overwhelming. She had never felt so helpless, so vulnerable. Then just as she was about to break down completely, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. It was Jack. Relief washed over her as she heard his footsteps on the front walk, followed by the low murmur of voices. Jack was talking to Tom, telling him to leave, to get away from their house and never come back. But Tom wasn't listening. His voice grew louder, more insistent, as he refused to back down. "She loves me, Jack. She's just afraid to admit it. But I know she loves me." Jack's patience snapped. "You need to leave now, Tom, before I call the police." There was a tense silence, and then Emma heard the sound of a struggle, a brief scuffle that made her heart skip a beat. She rushed to the window and peered out, her breath catching in her throat. Jack was standing in the driveway, his fists clenched, while Tom staggered back, his face twisted with fury. "You don't understand," Tom shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. "She's mine. She belongs with me." Jack took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. Emma is my wife, Tom. She doesn't belong to anyone, least of all you. Now get off my property before I make you." For a moment, it looked like Tom was going to lunge at Jack, his fist balled up and his eyes wild with rage. But then, something seemed to snap inside him. His shoulders slumped and he backed away, his gaze darting from Jack to the house, as if searching for some sign of Emma. "I'll go," Tom muttered, his voice hollow. "But this isn't over. She'll come to me. I know she will." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Jack stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his heart still pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't the end. He knew Tom wasn't going to give up that easily. But for now at least, Emma was safe. He quickly went inside, locking the door behind him. Emma was waiting for him in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Without a word, Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she trembled against him. "It's okay," he whispered, trying to reassure her as much as himself. "He's gone. You're safe now." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. This was far from over, and deep down, they both knew it. In the days following that terrifying night, Emma and Jack tried to regain a sense of normalcy, but it was clear that things had changed. The fear that had once been a dull throb in the back of Emma's mind was now a constant presence, an ever-present weight on her shoulders. She could no longer step outside without scanning the street for any sign of Tom. Even inside her own home, she felt like she was being watched, the security cameras offering little comfort. Jack, too, was on edge. He had always been protective of Emma, but now his concern bordered on paranoia. He checked the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a day, and he even took to parking his car in front of the house to keep a closer eye on their surroundings. The tension between them grew, not because of any fault of their own, but because of the constant looming threat that Tom represented. Despite the fear, life had to go on. Jack had to return to work, and Emma, though hesitant, tried to resume her normal routine. But the joy she once found in her daily activities was gone. Her morning jogs were now confined to the treadmill in the basement, and her gardening was abandoned entirely. She no longer felt the warmth of the sun on her face or the simple pleasure of tending to her flowers. Every moment was overshadowed by the fear that Tom might appear again. Tom, for his part, seemed to have disappeared. After that night, there were no more notes, no more unexpected visits. It was as if he had vanished from their lives, and for a brief moment, Emma dared to hope that it was over. Perhaps the confrontation with Jack had scared him off, made him realize that his obsession was futile. But Jack wasn't convinced. He knew how dangerous men like Tom could be, how obsession could drive a person to do terrible things. He had seen it in his work, in the cases he dealt with at the law firm, and he knew that the silence, the apparent calm, was often the most dangerous time of all. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Jack brought up the idea of going to the police. "I think we should file a restraining order," he said, his tone serious. "Even if he's gone now, we need to take precautions." Emma hesitated. The thought of involving the authorities made the situation feel even more real, more frightening. "Do you really think that's necessary?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack nodded. "I do. We can't afford to take any chances. You saw how he was that night. He's not thinking rationally, Emma. We need to protect ourselves." Emma knew he was right. But still, the idea of escalating things, of turning this nightmare into something official, terrified her. It was one thing to deal with Tom as a neighbor, a man who was clearly unwell, but to turn him into a criminal, to label him as a threat, it felt like a point of no return. Reluctantly, she agreed, and the next day, they went to the police. The officers listened carefully as they explained the situation, nodding sympathetically as Emma recounted the months of harassment, the notes, the confrontation. They promised to look into it, to keep an eye on Tom, and to expedite the restraining order. For a while, Emma felt a bit of relief. The thought that someone else knew, that there were people who could step in if things got worse, gave her a small sense of security. But deep down, the fear remained, gnawing at her every time she thought about Tom, every time she imagined him lurking in the shadows. And then, just as they were starting to let their guard down, the storm hit. It was a quiet evening, much like any other, when the storm finally broke. Emma and Jack were sitting down to dinner, the soft hum of the television playing in the background when the power suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Jack sighed, assuming it was just a power outage. "I'll go check the fuse box," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. But as he made his way to the basement, Emma noticed something that made her blood run cold. The street lamp outside their house was the only one still on. All the other houses on the street were dark, shrouded in an eerie silence. A sense of dread washed over her as she realized that this was no ordinary power outage. Something was wrong. She quickly followed Jack to the basement, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jack, wait!" she called, her voice trembling. Jack stopped and turned to her, the beam of the flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "What is it, Emma?" "Something's not right," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The other houses, they're all dark, except for ours." Jack's expression changed, his face tightening with concern. He immediately understood what she was saying. This wasn't a random outage. This was deliberate. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "I'm going to check outside." "No, don't go out there," Emma pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Please, Jack, what if it's him?" Jack hesitated, torn between the need to protect his wife and the instinct to confront whatever threat was out there. He knew Emma was right. Going outside could be dangerous, especially if Tom was involved. But he also knew they couldn't just sit in the dark, waiting for something to happen. "Okay," he said finally, pulling her close. "We'll stay together. Let's go back upstairs and lock all the doors and windows. We'll call the police." They hurried back upstairs, Jack's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but a place full of shadows and unseen threats. They quickly locked all the doors and windows, their movements frantic, the sense of urgency growing with each passing second. Just as Jack was reaching for the phone to call the police, there was a loud crash from the back of the house. It sounded like glass shattering, followed by the creak of footsteps on the hardwood floor. Someone was inside. Emma's heart leaped into her throat as she realized the terrifying truth. Tom had broken into their home. "Jack, he's here!" she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack grabbed a kitchen knife, his knuckles white as he held it in front of him. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his voice tense but steady. "We'll get out of this, Emma. Just stay close." They moved slowly through the house, the flashlight casting flickering beams of light that only seemed to deepen the shadows. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent shivers down their spines. The once familiar and comforting home had become a maze of fear. As they reached the living room, they saw him, Tom, standing in the middle of the room, a crazed look in his eyes. He was holding something in his hand, something sharp and gleaming in the dim light. It was a knife, and the sight of it made Emma's blood run cold. Tom's gaze locked onto Emma, his face twisted in a mix of longing and fury. "Why are you doing this, Emma?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Why are you trying to keep us apart? We're meant to be together." "Tom, you need to leave," Jack said, his voice calm but firm, trying to reason with the man. "This isn't right. You're not thinking clearly." But Tom wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on Emma, his obsession having completely consumed him. "You love me, Emma," he insisted, stepping closer. "I know you do. We can be happy, just you and me. Just let me make you happy." Emma's fear turned to anger, a desperate, defiant anger that gave her the strength to speak. "No, Tom, I don't love you. I never have. You need to leave us alone." Tom's face contorted with rage at her words, and in that moment, Emma knew there was no reasoning with him. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Jack stepped forward, his knife at the ready, trying to position himself between Tom and Emma. "Get out, Tom. I'm warning you." But Tom was beyond reason. He lunged at them, the knife flashing in the dim light. Chaos erupted as Jack and Tom grappled, the sound of their struggle filling the room. Emma stood frozen in fear, watching in horror as the man who had once been their neighbor, their friend, tried to destroy everything she held dear. The struggle between Jack and Tom was fierce, a desperate fight for survival. The room was filled with the sounds of grunts, the clattering of furniture, and the heavy breathing of two men locked in a life-or-death battle. Emma could only watch in terror as her husband fought to protect her. The sight of the two men grappling with each other seared into her mind. Tom's obsession had made him stronger, more desperate, and more dangerous than ever. He swung his knife wildly, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and madness. Jack, fueled by his determination to protect Emma, fought back with everything he had. The kitchen knife he held was their only defense against a man who had already crossed too many lines. "Emma, run!" Jack shouted, his voice strained as he struggled to keep Tom at bay. But Emma couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, her mind frozen with fear. All she could do was stand there, watching the horror unfold before her eyes. In the chaos, Tom managed to land a blow, slashing Jack's arm. Blood spattered on the floor, and Jack cried out in pain, momentarily losing his grip on the knife. Tom took advantage of the momentary lapse, knocking Jack to the ground. He loomed over him, his knife raised, ready to strike. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming for her to do something, anything, to stop what was about to happen. She knew that if she didn't act, she would lose Jack forever. In that split second, something inside her snapped, and she found the courage she thought she had lost. With a burst of adrenaline, Emma grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy lamp from the side table. Without thinking, she swung it with all her might, smashing it into Tom's head. The impact sent him staggering backward, the knife falling from his hand as he clutched his head in pain. "Jack, get up!" Emma screamed, her voice filled with urgency. Jack, bloodied and bruised, scrambled to his feet, grabbing the knife that Tom had dropped. He stood over Tom, who was now on the floor, dazed and disoriented. "Stay down, Tom," Jack warned, his voice cold and unyielding. But Tom, driven by his obsession, refused to give up. He lunged at Jack once more, his hands reaching for the knife, his eyes wild with desperation. In the ensuing struggle, Jack was forced to make a split-second decision. He knew that if he didn't act, both he and Emma could lose their lives. With a grim determination, Jack plunged the knife into Tom's side, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. Tom gasped, his eyes widening in shock as he collapsed to the floor. Emma rushed to Jack's side, her hands trembling as she reached for him, tears streaming down her face. "Jack, are you okay? Oh my God, you're bleeding." "I'm fine," Jack panted, his voice shaky but resolute. "It's over, Emma. It's finally over." But as they looked down at Tom, lying motionless on the floor, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The man who had once been their neighbor, a seemingly harmless figure in their lives, was now gone, his obsession having led him to his own demise. The aftermath of that fateful night left Emma and Jack in shock, grappling with the trauma they had endured. The police quickly arrived, assessing the scene: a shattered home, a blood-stained floor, and Tom Hudson's lifeless body. It was clear that the couple had acted in self-defense, but the emotional scars ran deep. Emma was haunted by the memories of that night, replaying the moment when she realized she had to fight for her life. Though she knew Tom's obsession wasn't her fault, the weight of what had happened lingered. Jack, too, wrestled with feelings of guilt, unable to shake the sense that he had failed to protect his wife from the horror that had unfolded. In the weeks that followed, they sought counseling, working together to heal from the trauma. Eventually, they decided to move away, leaving behind the neighborhood that had once been their sanctuary. The experience had changed them, leaving indelible marks on their hearts and minds. But as they began to rebuild their lives, they found strength in each other, determined to move forward. Though the memories would never fade entirely, they were survivors, united by the ordeal they had overcome. Together, they resolved to leave the darkness of the past behind and embrace the possibility of a brighter future. Don't let fear silence you. Share your thoughts below, subscribe for more true stories, and remember, awareness can be the difference between safety and tragedy.